Well, good evening. Okay, so this evening you get to hear about the gut-brain connection that we've been telling you about this week, and you're going to hear Chad's testimony about why this particular seminar is important to us personally. Each of them are, but this one in particular is very important to us. So let's dive in. You know that. One moment. Oh, it's not in. Okay. Sorry. All right. So this evening we're going to be talking about the gut-brain connection. And with the gut-brain connection, we are going to talk about not only science, but also the Bible and personal testimony. So it's a real blessing for us, and we want to share that blessing with you. So in the Bible, the gut-brain connection is really clear in the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel. Think about it, right? But you know what's so interesting is that the world also recognizes that there's something special about the book of Daniel. And what is that? It says here that the first clinical trial that has been discovered in all of the recorded history is found in the biblical book of Daniel. And this is an article from the National Institutes of Health. Okay, this is like the biggest in terms of how much funding they get. This is the biggest thing we have in our government in terms of how much money we pump into the National Institutes of Health. So this is a really neat thing that they're saying here. The first recorded clinical trial. Isn't that powerful? God is always first, right? He's the first to get to something, and especially if it's something good, I should say. So we can trust that the Bible is scientific as well, right? That in true science, I should say. So what is the story in Daniel chapter 1? Let's give a little background. And the background is that Daniel was taken captive into Babylon, and he left his home in Israel, right? And he was of the kingly sort, and he was well educated within his realm, right? And so when that would happen, if a king came and conquered your area, he would take you away and try to indoctrinate you and use you for his own good, right? So Daniel and his friends were taken captive. They were made slaves in Babylon, but in hopes that someday they would serve Babylon well. And they were put through the Babylonian education, a 3-year education in the Babylonian University, right? And in hopes that they would convert these boys as well, right? That these boys would become, and this is how we know that is because they changed their names, okay? If you change somebody's name, you want to change their character and their thoughts and everything. And so it wasn't just Daniel, but it was Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And what were their names changed to? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? And then Daniel's was Belteshazzar. Thank you. So in this story, Daniel and his friends are put to the test. What will they do when mom and dad aren't looking, right? What will they do when nobody from back home is watching? The only one that knows is the God of heaven, right? What will they do during this time? So they're put to the test. And praise the Lord, they come through, because we wouldn't be reading about Daniel if he didn't do well, right? So Daniel comes before the king, and the king wants to give him the best he has, right? But Daniel's like, oh man, can't eat this. God doesn't want me to eat this. And a lot of times we think food's nothing, right? We think, oh, big deal. What's the problem? But our world was destroyed over one piece of fruit. Right? If you put it in that perspective, one piece of fruit destroyed this whole planet. And so I think food is a big deal. I try not to make it a big deal when I'm sitting at a meal, but it can be a big deal, right? Our whole world has been destroyed over it. But anyway, Daniel and his friends understood this, and they decided, we're going to tell the king, no, we can't eat like this because we serve the God of heaven. And in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, it says, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. It was so important for Daniel not to defile his body, because what we've been learning this week is that the body is connected to the mind. And God speaks to us through our minds, through our frontal lobe, right? And Daniel wanted his choices to be firm and good. And so he decided, I have to make this stance. He was faithful in the little things. He was faithful in the little things. So then, the leader of the eunuchs, he was like, oh no, if I do this, it's going to be my head, right? Because like most people, you realize that, just a moment. Okay. Sorry, like most people, you realize, just a moment. We're on a little bit of a time constraint, so I'm just going to give it over to Chad. Sorry.
Sorry about that. All right, here, I'll take it. Thank you. All right, we will press on. So Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself, and he said, prove your servants. This is the actual test. This is the oldest historical recorded study in history. And so let's look at this. He said, prove your servants, I beseech you, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. And so this was the actual test that took place. Now let's look at this. So 10 days. What were they to eat? It says specifically pulse. And pulse are things that are grown from seeds, right? So Daniel and his friends, for a 10-day period, went on a plant-based diet. And it says, now at the end of these days, the king had said that he should bring them in. Then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before King Nebuchadnezzar. And it says, before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them. And among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. Now, it's interesting because it says that what Daniel ate, the diet that he and his friends chose to go on, actually enhanced their what? Their intellect. It actually enhanced their intellect. And, it says, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So the question is, can diet affect our intellect according to the Bible? Yes, it can. So the first scientific study, and this is given to us from the National Institutes of Health. They are the ones who say this. The largest health institution on the planet says that this chapter, Daniel chapter 1, is the oldest scientific study in all of recorded history. And it's interesting. It's a study of what happens with food in connection with your brain, with the intellect. So I'm going to share with you a video from our documentary, Ancient Health. It's just a few-minute clip here, so we'll give this a try.
But the main thing that folks should be concerned about is how long you live and how likely you are to get disease. And there have been 3 major studies published on this subject, big meta-analyses. And these meta-analyses, and only 3 big ones have been published, they show consistently that low-carb diets, in other words, low plant food diets, high animal food diets, consistently they show that they're associated with more heart disease and more death, more mortality.
If you look around the world and you look at these people in the blue zones, the average percentage of calories from carbs ranges from about 50% to about 80%. Carbs are not the enemy, refined carbs are the enemy.
There have been a number of recent studies. Dr. Beeshold out of Phoenix, Arizona, first she did an observational study showing that plant-based diet actually significantly improves your depression and anxiety stress score. It's called a DASS score.
So the mood actually is improved when you get the right amount of carbohydrates, but also the right type of carbohydrates and less protein.
Then she followed up with an interventional study, and that's where she took people who are not on a plant-based diet and put them on a plant-based diet for 2 weeks. She also put them on a plant-based diet plus fish for 2 weeks to see which one would be superior. And it turned out the fish diet wasn't any more superior than the carnivore diet. But the plant-based diet, significant, dramatic changes, statistically significant changes in just 2 weeks in their mental ability.
We see when people go on this diet and drink plenty of water, get plenty of rest, follow these natural remedies, that it's just like something snaps in their brain, and it doesn't take like weeks or months.
Plant-based diet is key in our program for depression and anxiety recovery. The results are outstanding because it's a comprehensive approach. It's not just diet. We also utilize exercise, and we're utilizing correct thoughts and a lot of different modalities. But the diet is a key element.
I went on a plant-based diet about 5 weeks ago.
It's amazing because even if they had not told me he had the diet change, the first thing I noticed was he was bringing his schoolwork in.
And my teacher has actually been bragging on how much better I've been behaving since I've been on the diet.
In class, he wasn't getting as distracted, that he was paying attention, he was able to listen more closely, he was being alert, his discernment was better, he was more diligent, everything.
I can pay attention more. My mind is more clear since I've been on the diet.
It's just a huge improvement. And I also noticed he lost a lot of weight. But the main things I noticed was behavioral.
A study in a middle school has showed clearly that switching the menu from animal source to plant source diet almost eliminated absenteeism, increased and enhanced attention and homework performance and performance at school. It almost eliminated acts of violence as well as teen pregnancies.
And so they just feel better. Everywhere the blood flows, everywhere that perfect circulation goes, they feel better. Not just in body, but in mind. Clears up their thoughts even.
And every single day since I've been on a plant-based diet, the clarity continues to increase and my face continues to look younger, and my body feels like I look more vibrant. I've looked at pictures of myself before and after, and I look 5 years older, even just 10 months ago, than I do now.
What we eat does get turned into neurotransmitters. It actually helps us or hurts us, depending on what we're eating in regards to our brain chemistry. And it plays a vital role in health of the brain.
They'll say within 3 or 4 days, they seem to have clarity. They're alert. They listen in class better. They absorb more, and they do better on their tests.
The fog has been lifted out of my head. I think clearer. I've got better ideas, I believe. I can put 2 and 2 together faster, and just in general, I'm happier.
In fact, diet alone, studies show that diet alone will reduce your depression and anxiety scores by half just by dramatically changing your diet to a plant-based. And so that's significant. Now, we go for more than just half, and so that's why we have a whole program that includes more than this. But just the diet alone will make a big difference.
You don't have to choose between high quality living and longevity. It's the same program. The same New Start approach to living helps you live longer, and it helps you live better.
It's quite fascinating, isn't it? That a study done in a middle school, you take middle schoolers on a typical standard American diet, you change their diet to a plant-based diet, And what did we discover? That it enhanced the intellect today of the students that were in that school. But not only did it enhance their intellect, it enhanced their morality. Now, isn't that fascinating? That food could actually enhance not only your cognition, not only help you to do better in school, but it also could enhance your morality. This is very interesting. And so the first scientific study in the Bible was about the gut-brain connection. It's been replicated today, and it also enhances your brain power today as it did 2,500 years ago in the days of Daniel. The Bible says in Lamentations chapter 1, verse 20, "Behold, O Lord, for I am in distress, my" what? "Bowels are troubled." Isn't that interesting? That in Bible times, they noticed that there was a connection between their emotional state and what was going on in their bowels. This is interesting. Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 19 says, my bowels, I am pained at my very" what? "Heart. I'm pained at my very heart." So there is this emotional connection that is also connected to the gut. And we're going to see that this is right now cutting edge science today. What's one of the interesting things is that within your body, you have something that connects your brain to your gut called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve, what's interesting about it is that you would imagine that your brain is telling your gut all kinds of things, but actually your gut, 90% of the information that goes through the vagus nerve actually goes from the gut to the brain and not the other way around. This is absolutely fascinating. So notice this quotation here from a book some of you may have seen before called Counsels in Diet and Foods, page 50. It says, "The abuses of the stomach by the gratification of appetite are a fruitful source of most church trials." Doesn't that sound strange? Meaning, 15 years ago, this would have sounded like 19th century quackery to many people. And yet right now, it's what? It's cutting edge science, and I'm going to share with you some of that science right now. But this actually says the abuses of the stomach, meaning the stomach is the source of most problems within the church. Wow, what a thought. How could that be? Now we're going to look at the science behind this. Now, scientists have discovered that a high-fat diet leads to depressive, anxious symptoms, well, in this case in mice, and it also promotes inflammation. So here's the study. What they did is they took some mice and they put one group on a high-fat diet, And this group on the high-fat diet began to exhibit inflammation. They began to have inflammation within their body. They began to have repetitive behaviors. They began to have depressive symptoms, and they also began to have memory problems. Very interesting. So then they took another group of mice and they put them on a standard fat diet, and they did not exhibit all the same negative characteristics. And what they then chose to do was to make basically they took the regular diet mice and they gave them microbes from the high-fat diet mice. They did a bacteria transplant from the high-fat group into the standard fat group mice. Now, what ended up happening? Once that bacteria went from the high-fat group to the standard fat group, the standard fat group began to exhibit anxiety, impaired memory, repetitive behaviors, and inflammation. Now, isn't that interesting? That the bacteria in the guts of these mice could affect their emotional state and their memory. That's very interesting. So now, could it be that we were given this information many years ago? Notice what we read from a book called Child Guidance, page 398. It says, eating too frequently, too much, and of rich, unwholesome food. Rich might be sugary, it might be high fat. Unwholesome food destroys the healthy action of the digestive organs, affects the brain, and perverts the judgment, preventing rational, calm, healthy thinking and acting. Isn't that interesting? That the food that we eat, eating rich food, can actually affect our judgment, and it can affect our emotional state, our digestive organs. We also read here on page 460, it says it cannot be too often repeated that whatever is taken into the stomach affects not only the body, but ultimately the mind as well. It is difficult and often well nigh impossible for one who is intemperate in diet to exercise patience and self-control. Isn't that interesting? So it seems that what goes into the gut is very, very important. Eating too much or of rich and unwholesome food can actually hurt us in areas of self-control. May even lead to things like addictions. We're going to get to that in a little bit and look at some of the science behind this. Now, this is a biblical concept. The first place to really give this insight is 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5 and 6, where it says, add to your faith virtue. This is that spiritual growth that we have as Christians. And add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance what? Patience. So what comes before patience? Temperance. You see, this is where this concept comes from, that if we are intemperate, we just read it could be well nigh impossible to exhibit patience and self-control. Very, very interesting. And in a Scientific American article that came out just a few years ago, 2016, the actual title is this. This is the title: Think Twice How the Gut's Second Brain Influences Mood and what? Well-being. Scientists are now calling the gut the second what? The second brain. And that your second brain, your gut, influences your mood and well-being. Now, the article specifically mentions how GI or gastrointestinal trouble or turmoil can sour your mood. So gastrointestinal gut turmoil can sour your moods. Now, this is interesting. So this is coming from, a scientific journal today in 2016 anyway. And notice what it says here. This was given to us over 100 years ago in Counsels in Diet and Foods. It says, people who have a sour stomach are very often of a what? Sour disposition. It's as if the scientific journals are quoting these books from 100 years ago. Very, very interesting. People who have a sour stomach are very often of a sour disposition. Everything seems to be contrary to them, and they're inclined to be peevish and irritable. If we would have peace among ourselves, we should give more thought than we do to having a peaceful what? Stomach. Isn't that interesting? I mean, who would think the stomach would be such a big deal? But what are we seeing in the scientific journals today? Almost word for word what we read 100 years ago. Just over 100 years ago. And did you know that 2/3 of your immune system is actually found in your gut? So, if you can actually, we know about this. If you go to bed late, they did a study and they found out if you're used to going to bed at 10 o'clock and you go one night to bed at 3 a.m., what ends up happening is that it drops your immune system, the function of your immune system, by about 50%. That's significant. And so, 2/3 of your immune system is in your gut. So my wife and I find this when we travel overseas, if we're going, serious, time travel across the world, what ends up happening is we have to be very careful with our stomachs because, you've just dropped your immune system by traveling, 36 hours of very little sleep. You have to be very careful for a few days. And we've had to learn that. And sometimes we've had to learn it the hard way, actually. But this is interesting. C-section babies. Scientists have done a massive study on C-section babies, and they've discovered something very, very interesting. That C-section babies, of which I am one, I am a C-section baby, they have statistically higher disease rates. Now, this was a massive study. It was reported in the journal Pediatrics of 2 million babies studied over the course of 35 years. So what did they discover? They found that C-section babies have statistically higher rates of allergies, higher rates of asthma, higher rates of bowel disorders, higher rates of rheumatism, and also leukemia. Isn't that interesting? And other than the leukemia, I grew up with allergies and asthma and bowel problems and never had, officially had rheumatism, but for years would have achy joints. Most of my life I did, although it's gotten better now that my diet has changed. The joint pain is so much better. I feel great now. But so praise the Lord for that. And praise the Lord I haven't had leukemia yet and hope to never have that. But statistically, they have higher rates. It doesn't mean that every single one who is a C-section baby will have all of these. So why is this? And one of the things the scientists are pointing to that may be one of the causative factors of why these disease rates are much worse is because of bacteria. And what do we mean? What they're talking about is the fact that as a baby goes through the birth canal of its mother, it is when the baby is first introduced largely to bacteria. There may have been some in the womb, but very little generally in the womb before the baby is actually born. And so what happens is when a baby is born naturally, as it goes through the birth canal, it's introduced to the bacteria of its mother, which is the bacteria that it needs to have a healthy functioning immune system. But what happens if a baby is cut out, where does the baby get its first bacteria? Well, maybe from the gloves of the doctor, maybe from the hospital. And which of these different options do you think would be the best place to get the bacteria you need? Clearly, it would be from mother, the way that God intended it to be. Now, if somebody's going to die and they don't have a choice, I mean, you have to do what you have to do. But in general, the healthiest thing to do is to do things the way that God intended, right? And so, does the bacteria help? It helps with our immune system. Our gut is filled with different kinds of bacteria, and we're going to talk more about this. Now, one of the things that they found with little children, they took little children, and actually specifically toddlers. They did a scientific study on toddlers, and you know what they discovered? As they looked at toddlers, they found that they analyzed the bacteria within the guts of toddlers, and they found something that was very striking, very fascinating, really. They discovered that toddlers who had a greater diversity of gut bacteria were more social, more open, more positive, and more outgoing. And the toddlers that had less diversity of gut bacteria were more antisocial and threw more tantrums than other children. Isn't that interesting? So having a greater diversity of gut bacteria, and we're going to look at another study about this in just a moment, but having a greater diversity of gut bacteria seems to make you actually happier. Isn't that interesting? I mean, who would have guessed? Now, so that being the case, we're going to ask the question, if having a greater diversity of gut bacteria is so important, if you want a good ratio of good bacteria in your gut, what should you do? It's a good question, right? What should you do? Well, this is an article from Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, and it was headed out by a doctor who has worked with the United States government. His name is Neil Barnard. Some of you may have heard of him. He's worked with the United States government doing a study on reversing type 2 diabetes, and Neil Barnard, on his website, we saw back in September of 2015, this was the title of this article. So if you want a good ratio of good bacteria within your gut, what should you do? The title of this article was Vegan Diets Lead to Healthier Intestinal Bacteria. Interesting. Vegan diets lead to healthier intestinal bacteria. Now, why is this? Now, what we discovered was that having a greater diversity of gut bacteria makes you happier, makes you healthier. Now, how do we get a greater diversity? Well, each plant-based food, actually all food really, has bacteria on it. The trouble is that there's bacteria that can end up causing problems in animal-based products. It can cause processes that take place within the gut that cause health-destroying process to take place within your gut. Whereas on plant-based foods, you have a diversity on each type of plant, whether it's an apple or it's a banana, or whether it's a peach or a pear or a plum, or it could be lettuce, or it could be tomato, it could be sweet potato, and all these different things. They all have some maybe similar bacteria and some different bacteria. And as we eat a diversity of plant-based foods, we end up getting a diversity of these healthy bacteria that are good for our gut and potentially good for our immune system. Now, if you were to think about the Bible, and you were to just imagine from what the Bible says, what would be the healthiest diet for good bacteria within your gut, you would probably guess, well, maybe it would be the diet that God gave in Genesis chapter 129, where it says, and God said, behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree yielding the fruit of a tree, to you it shall be for meat or food. King James says meat, or the New Translation say food. So God says, listen, I've given you every herb-bearing seed. So he says, I've given you the plant-based food. So if you were to guess what would be the healthiest food to make you actually the happiest, you would guess that, well, probably the food God gave Adam in the Garden of what? Eden. Yes, and the word Eden means in the Hebrew language what? It means pleasure, right? So if it was the garden of pleasure, you would just infer as a Christian that the food that God gave Adam in his sinless state in the garden of pleasure would be the food that would make you have pleasure, to make you happy. And this is what science is showing us today. Now, why is it? What are some of the reasons? Well, we know it gives us a good diversity of gut bacteria, and we're going to get more into that in just a moment. But there's other things that are found in plant-based foods, which are very fascinating. This is taken from the Bulgarian Journal of Plant Physiology. In a review, they were looking at plants, and they were looking at what plants are constructed from. And this particular review in the Bulgarian Journal of Plant Physiology says that animal neurotransmitter substances are found in what? Plants. Now, what are neurotransmitters? I mean, to make it very simple, we could call them brain chemicals. We could call them brain chemicals, to make it very simple. So you have these brain chemicals, chemicals that would make you happy or help you to make maybe good decisions or to experience pleasure. And where are these chemicals found? They're found in plants. The food that God gave to us, we actually have the chemicals that God made to make us happy. Now, interestingly, we're going to now look at a study that was done on alcoholics. And they looked at alcoholics, and they discovered that there was an imbalance of bacteria within the guts of certain alcoholics. Some of the alcoholics they found had a greater diversity of gut bacteria, and some of the alcoholics had less diversity of gut bacteria. Which of the two groups do you think would struggle more with alcohol? Just guess. Those who had less gut bacteria. Let's find out what the scientific study showed. This was a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It revealed an imbalance of the gut bacteria in some of the alcoholics. It was a smaller study, 60 alcoholics. 24 of these alcoholics had lower levels of bacteria in their guts, so they didn't have as great of diversity. Well, what was the result? After 19 days alcohol-free, those with lower levels of bacteria had higher levels of anxious feeling, depression, and desire for alcohol. Isn't that interesting? I mean, to me, that's absolutely fascinating. And the 36 participants with better gut flora were doing better. Now, I used to drink heavily, and I was a smoker, and I struggled to stop smoking. And it's interesting. I was sharing these scientific studies and what the Bible says with a friend of mine who is he's addicted to methamphetamine. And as I was sharing it with him, he looked at me and he said something very interesting. He said, "You know what all true drug addicts have in common?" He said, "Most all of them have a terrible diet." They have a terrible diet. Now, if they're eating junk food or unhealthy food or refined food or all kinds of meat and cheese and dairy and all these kind of things, they're not going to have a good diversity of good gut bacteria, right? And they found that the 36 participants with better gut flora were doing better. Now, how could you have a greater diversity of gut bacteria if you were struggling with alcohol, or if you wanted to help someone overcome their addiction to drugs or alcohol? How could you help them to get a greater diversity of gut bacteria? You could encourage them to eat a diversity of plant-based foods. Does that make sense? You can encourage them to get out there and get that fruit. You could go buy them some, oranges and apples and bananas and, cherries and all these different kinds of things. And it's interesting, if God knew about these things, maybe he could have just told us. The fascinating thing is we were told these things over 100 years ago. Listen to this from Counsels in Diet and Foods, page 311. In our medical institutions, clear instruction should be given in regard to temperance. The patient should be shown the evil of intoxicating liquor and the blessing of total abstinence. They should be asked to discard the things that have ruined their health, like alcohol and so forth, and in place of these things should be supplied with an abundance of what? Fruit. Oranges, lemons, prunes, peaches, and many other varieties can be obtained, for the Lord's world is productive if painstaking effort is put forth. Wow. So we were told all of these things, all of the signs. Before any of these studies had come out, we see this. And so do we see, this is a study that was done in Queensland, Australia, the University of Queensland. And the title of the study is that fruit is a depression buster for women. What does that mean? What they found is that women who ate more fruit had lower levels of depression. Very interesting. It was a study, I think, around 6,000 women. Well, you say, well, maybe it works just for women. No, it also helps with men. But we're going to look at that in just a moment. There was a letter in the Journal of Neuropsychiatry and Clinical Neurosciences, and it was medical professionals talking about the fact that there are, as we said before, neurotransmitters in fruit. And as they talked about this, they talked about these various neurotransmitters, and they talked about what fruit had them, and just basically eating a diversity of fruit. And they said, as people eat this, it may lower the levels of depression and lower the chances that people will have violent suicide attempts by having people eat more fruit. Isn't that interesting? Depression and fruit treatment. Could we actually find more happiness in fruit? It's a good question. In the British Journal of Health Psychology, they had a title of another study, and this one is "Many Apples a Day Keep the Blues Away." And it goes on to say daily experiences of negative and positive affect and food consumption in young adults. And so they've looked at women, they looked at young adults, and they've looked at people of different ages, and they found that people who eat more fruits and more vegetables, this specific study was fruits and vegetables, that they are actually happier. This is the chart that we see in one of the studies that was done. This is interesting. So they found down at the bottom is how many pieces of fruit you have in a day. And they found that if you have 0 pieces of fruit or vegetable in a day, you're the least happy you're going to statistically be for that day. Statistically, but anyway. And if you have 1 piece, you're just a tiny bit happier, a fruit or vegetable in a day. If you have 2, you become, maybe significantly happier by that point. Then you have 3, you're happier. 4, happier than that. 5, even more. 6 more. 7, happier. And 8, look how much happier you get to be. So you actually get to choose how happy you're going to be each day, right? That's good news, wouldn't you say? That you actually get to choose. Now, here's the thing. They actually found that based upon how many pieces of fruits or vegetables people eat, when I say pieces, that's it was actually the amount of servings per day. So the amount of servings, so if you had 1 serving, 2 serving, up to 8. And interestingly enough, what they found is that it actually foretold how happy somebody would be the next day. So they could actually tell. It was actually forecast. They could tell, okay, if you've had this many, you're going to be happier tomorrow. So it actually enhanced your happiness the next day. So if you want to choose to be happy today, you have to eat plenty of fruits and vegetables today. But if you want to be happy tomorrow, you need to eat plenty of them today, right? And don't go home and eat a ton of fruit tonight, okay? It's a little too late, right? Start tomorrow, okay? If you didn't eat any today, you can do it tomorrow, okay? But so, we think about these things, and I'm going to share with you this right here. Now, this is very fascinating. Spicy food. Now, this is just, I could say, beginning right here. You may have read some of these things before, but I found 2 studies. One of the studies found that they could actually guess a certain characteristic of men. They could actually guess how spicy they liked their food based upon a certain characteristic in men. Isn't that interesting? So spicy food may actually affect your character. That's interesting. We're talking about the gut, brain connection. And spicy food can actually have an impact on it. I found 2 different studies, that one particularly there, and I also found another study on specifically 1 spice and sexual function. So there seems to be some connection here. Now, these are probably just preliminary. Over time, I imagine more studies will come out. But we were told in a number of years ago that a similar condition is produced under the irritating influence of fiery spices. With the stomach in such a state, there is a craving for something more to meet the demands of appetite. Something stronger and still stronger. Next, you will find your sons out on the street learning to smoke. You think, what does smoking have to do with the fact that my family likes spicy food? That's interesting. But we're now discovering that it can actually affect character. Spicy food can. It is a grievous lesson. It makes them deathly sick, yet they press the matter through with a perseverance that would be praiseworthy in a better cause. Tobacco weakens the brain and paralyzes its fine sensibilities. Its use excites a thirst for strong drink, and in very many cases lays the foundation for the liquor habit. Now, it's interesting because the scientific institutions in the days that this was written didn't say that smoking was bad for you, right? I mean, this was written well over 100 years ago. But it was saying that spicy food could actually affect the character of young people and cause them to do things and have a bad character and bring them to the point where they become addicts to substances. What a strange idea. It says here, spices at first irritate the tender coating of the stomach, but finally destroy the natural sensitiveness of this delicate membrane. The blood becomes fevered, the animal propensities are aroused, while the moral and intellectual powers are weakened and become servants to the baser passions. So could it be that eating spicy food may actually affect your levels of lust? Very interesting. I'll just be totally honest with you. My wife and I have tested it out, and we found out it's true. Just being totally honest with you. And it's very interesting. We learned that as we stayed away from spicy food, I'll just be very honest with you, I grew up eating extremely spicy food. I mean, to be honest, some of the most spicy food you could possibly imagine. And that's what I grew up doing. I can't blame my smoking habit and drinking habit growing up on that. Who knows? But it's interesting that it potentially could affect those things. And here's the thing. So my wife and I, we stopped eating them for like maybe a month, 2 months. And I'll just be honest. Our marriage, there was more peace. There was more joy, even within our marriage. And then somebody invited us out to a Thai restaurant. Not Thai, no, an Indian restaurant. And as we went out, and what we've discovered, we have tested this over and over and over. I'm just being very open and honest with you. We've tested this over and over, and we found with 100% accuracy that it affects our moods the next day, not the day that we eat them. We notice no difference. I could eat a super spicy meal today, no effect, till tomorrow. And to be honest with you, it truly affects, and this is the thing, and it doesn't just affect the next day, it affects in the next several days, maybe almost a week, until the stomach begins to settle down as we get away from it. So I'm not saying this to judge anybody, but you may, if somebody struggles in their marriage, that might be something to learn to cut out. If somebody struggles with lust, that might be something to cut out. And like I said, you won't notice within a day a difference. It takes a while. And so just something to consider to potentially have happier children, to have a happier husband, a happier wife, and a happier family. Because God gave us the health message. One of the reasons, as we've already seen, was to make us happy, right? So that's what we're talking about. So in the gut-brain connection, one of the factors that helps us with eating a whole plant-based diet, and when I say whole, I don't mean that everything needs to be raw, but meaning eating a whole food that doesn't have refined food in it. Nothing refined. What happens is, you see, as you eat fruits and vegetables, in the plant kingdom, plants have a substance within them called fiber. There's no fiber in the animal kingdom. And you may say, and you may have heard before, well, we can't digest fiber. It helps us, helps move things along and make you regular, no question. But many say, well, we can't digest fiber, which is true. But what scientists have discovered is that bacteria within your gut, mainly within the large intestine. I mean, there's bacteria in the small intestine too, but largely the bacteria that's within the large intestine has the ability to digest fiber, and as it digests the fiber, it gives off a byproduct that are called short-chain fatty acids. So they give this off, and short-chain fatty acids lower inflammation in the body, and one of the markers for many people that are depressed is that they have higher levels of inflammation. And so eating this, whole plant-based foods, getting the fiber can actually lower the inflammation and can potentially lower the levels of depression and make you happier. So we eat the food closer to the way that God made it for us. Now I'm going to share with you a little bit here about for a dyspeptic stomach. What is a dyspeptic stomach? Well, it has to do with of having indigestion or consequent maybe irritability or depression from having a dyspeptic or a troubled stomach. And you may not have stomach trouble, even pain, but still struggle with some of these things even without the pain, but still having, emotional side effects. So for a dyspeptic stomach, you may place upon your tables fruits of different kinds, but not too many at one meal. For a dyspeptic stomach, you may place upon your tables fruits of different kinds, but not too many at one meal. And so eating a diversity of fruit could help heal the stomach. And we're going to look a little bit more at this. We read, it would be well for us to do less cooking and eat more fruit in its natural state. Let us eat freely of fresh grapes, apples, peaches, oranges, blackberries, and all other kinds of fruit which can be obtained. My wife and I were walking down the road outside of here just a couple days ago, and you know what we found in the woods? Muscadines. They're good. Have you ever had them? They're like Concord grapes, but very thick outer covering. But my wife and I like the outer covering too, actually, so I just eat the whole thing. But they're fantastic. So you can find all kinds of different things. And did you know that in this area, I found a passion fruit, wild passion fruit growing out there. I had no idea you could find passion fruit here. But sure enough, we found one just down the road. Fascinating. So these things, it'd be well for us to eat more of these things. Now, one of the things we do is we teach people how they can potentially reset their stomach. We are told here in Counsels in Diet and Foods, over 100 years ago, in many cases of sickness, the very best remedy is for the patient to fast for a meal or two, that the overworked organs of digestion may have an opportunity to rest. A fruit diet for a few days has often brought great relief to brain workers. Many times, a short period of entire abstinence from food, followed by simple, moderate eating, has led to recovery through nature's own recuperative effort. An abstemious diet for a month or two would convince many sufferers that the path of self-denial is the path to health. Now, isn't that interesting? So some of the things here, just to sum up, ways to help balance out, to reset your gut. Number one, fasting. It doesn't mean you need to fast all the time, but if you're struggling with some of these things, it doesn't say fast for a month or two or a week or two. It says for a meal or two, right? So you may have to just fast for a meal or two to let my wife and I were just traveling over in Malaysia and got stomach trouble. You go overseas and it just happens sometimes. And one of the best things that you find to help reset your gut is literally skip a meal or two. So I skipped them, at least 2 meals, 2 or 3. Yeah, basically 2 meals. And afterward, the stomach does so much better. And then if you'd like to try it, after that, you can begin to eat more whole fruits. We read there, it said you could eat them for a couple days, just eat fruit, to really let the gut begin to settle down and to rest for a few days, it said. And the only caution we have is for type 2 diabetics. But some of the latest science right here, this is taken from the British Medical Journal, and this is diabetes and fruit consumption, and anything below the line lowers your chances of getting type 2 diabetes. And the only one that seems to have some effect to potentially, for some people, only some of the people, is cantaloupe. But strawberries in general lower your chances of type 2 diabetes. Oranges lower it more. Peaches, plums, and apricots lower it more. Grapefruit lower it more. Bananas more. Apples and pears even more. Prunes, interestingly, prunes lower your chances of diabetes, and prunes are dried what? They're dried plums. So dried fruit can actually lower your chances of diabetes sometimes more than the actual fresh one. Fascinating. And so, prunes, grapes, and raisins more, and blueberries seem to do a real number. And this is a study of over 100,000 people. So very interesting. So in general, fruit actually is beneficial for diabetics, but work with your doctor. We're not telling you to, go against doctor's orders, but you could work with it and see what you can do. So let's go forward. So number 2 is to eat more whole fruits. Number 3 is to eat more whole grains, if you can. If you don't have celiac disease, you're not gluten intolerant. The majority of people are not, but if you are, you have to obviously make sure to avoid those things. But for those of you who are not, intolerant to wheat or gluten, eat more whole grains like whole wheat bread, oatmeal, other well-cooked grains. You want them to be well cooked. You can digest them much better. And also, eat more whole vegetables. When I say whole, once again, that would be something that is not refined. So you're eating the whole I don't mean the entirety of the plant, but like a sweet potato. You're eating you cook it and you eat it. Or it could be broccoli. You actually eat the broccoli, not some nutrients from the broccoli, but the actual, plant food. And so the next one to balance your gut is to avoid spicy food, especially if you struggle with anger problems or lust or these kinds of things. And the last one here is to eat maybe, a handful of nuts a day. If you're a young man or very athletic, you may eat, maybe a few handfuls, but you may need a little bit more. So doing these things can help so very much to enhance your health and to enhance your happiness. Now, I'm going to share with you two things in closing tonight. The first one I find so very fascinating. This is about the Victor Valley Medium Community Correctional Facility in Adelanto, California. That is the longest name for a prison I've ever heard. But in this particular prison, they hired, the state of California, the California Department of Corrections, hired a successful Seventh-day Adventist businessman to run this prison. And it was a 500-inmate prison. And they allowed the prisoners to choose between a New Start program. New Start is an acronym that has to do with nutrition, exercise, water, sunlight, temperance, air, rest, and trust in God. And they could choose between, there were literally two physical sides to the prison that were not connected, meaning you couldn't just hang out on one side and hang out on the other one later. You literally had to choose when you went in, did you want to go on the New Start side or the standard American prison side with the standard American prison diet, the meat-based, animal-based diet. And so you were allowed to choose between the New Start program of a vegan diet, that means just plant-based foods, occupational training, Bible studies, and anger management classes. Now, most all prisons, maybe every prison in America has Bible studies, wouldn't you say? Basically, all prisons have that. But this prison, now, they allowed the prisoners to choose to go on a vegan diet. One of the workers in the CDC, the California Department of Corrections, said, no way. These guys will never go on a vegan diet. They would rather burn the place to the ground than go vegan. Now, you know what ended up happening? What percentage, just take a guess, what percentage of these men chose willingly to become vegan? It was actually 85% of them chose to go vegan. Now here's the thing. Prisoners are rebels. That makes sense? Most of society, they're just not as rebellious to go vegan, right? These people are like, yeah, we'll do it. Why not? If this could help me, why not give it a try? That was their thought process, right? And what if it would help? What if it could make that big of a difference? So what ended up happening? So 85% of them chose to go vegan. Now, the recidivism rate, recidivism is a word that has to do with the statistical chance at which when you go to prison one time, the statistical chance that when you're let out, you break the law and have to go back to prison again. That's called recidivism. And at that time in the state of California, the recidivism rate was 95%. So if you went to prison one time, there's a 95% chance that you would go back into prison. That's terrible, isn't it? While this man ran this prison, the rate dropped from 95% to 2%. Can you imagine? And a number of years later, the government took this place back and things tanked there. Now, could you imagine what if this would have taken off? What if this would have spread from just, the Adelanto, California, and it would have spread to the people from, LA, San Francisco, Houston, Dallas, Detroit? What if this would have spread across the nation and crime began to just plummet in America? Well, number one, we'd have a lot less need for massive prisons, wouldn't we? But do you see how much this impact, and you can go on YouTube and watch it for yourself. You can watch the testimonies of the people who were in this place, how their lives were totally changed by it. What if this would have taken off? Could it be? Now, if God knew it was so important to eat these things that it could actually, that food could have to do with crime, could you imagine? Notice what we read here. Ministry of Healing 146. Wrong habits of eating and the use of unhealthful food are in no small degree responsible for the intemperance and what? Crime and wretchedness that curse the world. Do you see we were told that intemperance and unhealthful food are one of the major causative factors of crime in the world today? And now we have proof. We can see that. And I'll tell you what, I felt like an addict most of my life. I want to be very honest with you. I was a smoker, I was a drinker, just dabbled with the drugs, but in general, when I would do something, I would become addicted to it. Had an absolutely terrible diet. I was in college, and I had never had a salad in my entire life, ever. I don't ever remember having lettuce in my whole life, not even on a hamburger. Ever. I had an absolutely horrible diet. And I felt like, I couldn't stop smoking. I would, for a time, I would drink myself to sleep at night. And even then, after finding victory over those things, the Lord gave me victory, but I still felt like an addict, just like an addict who didn't do drugs. Does that make sense? Didn't smoke, didn't do these things anymore. And it wasn't until I implemented these things that I'm talking to you about that my life was actually changed, and I no longer feel like an addict today. I was reading my Bible day by day and still felt like an addict. But it wasn't until I implemented some of these principles, and I want to close tonight with a personal experience. I ended up, after giving my life to the Lord, a few years later, about 4 years after giving my life to the Lord, I went and did some mission work in the country of Iceland. And it was with Fadia and a friend named Nathaniel, who was from Michigan. And we went over to Iceland, and all of us got sick from the water at the house we were staying in. So we all got stomach trouble. We would drink a glass of water and run to the toilet and it would empty us out, to be very, blunt. And so we could tell it was very clearly the water that was giving us the trouble. And the entire year we were in Iceland, we all had stomach trouble. Now, when I got there, I was in pretty good shape. I worked out and everything, but I ended up losing like 30 pounds while I was there. So I was super skinny. And so that was the beginning of my stomach troubles. And Fadia, she lost a whole bunch of weight. So we're just, we're eating plenty of food, by the way. I mean, we ate plenty of food, but we just got very skinny. Now, Nathaniel, when he got there, he was overweight. When he left, he looked fantastic. So it worked for him. It didn't work very well for us, And, we got back to the States, and for another year, we had the same trouble. Like, it just continued on. And, but I'll tell you, for the first time in my life, I experienced seasonal depression while I was in Iceland. And so I experienced that, and so we had the depression while we were there. Then we came back to the States, and then I had seasonal depression basically each year after that. So each winter. Now, I was eating a healthy diet. Basically a plant-based diet, a vegan diet, most of this time. Some of the time would be vegetarian, but most of that time would be vegan, but still was struggling with depression. And as this went on for about 8 years, I continued studying my Bible and, teaching and traveling the world and making documentary films and all these things, but was struggling with depression. Well, then after 8 years of that, I got bit by a tick. It was either, here in Arkansas or Tennessee or somewhere. And a doctor friend of mine said, well, just to be careful, you should just take some antibiotics. So she wrote me up, antibiotic prescription. I took the antibiotics, and then I went into depression year-round. And it's interesting. I didn't know the science behind it at the time, but they've done a study looking at depression and antibiotic use. And what they discovered is that for every round of antibiotics you take, it increases your chances of depression by about 25%. And for every 2 to 5 rounds that you take, and a round is when you go to the doctor and he says, here, take these antibiotics for the next, week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is. That's a round of antibiotics. For every 2 to 5 rounds that you take, it increases your chances of depression by about 50%. Now, think it through logically with what you've just learned tonight. Now, what do antibiotics kill? They kill bacteria. And having a greater diversity of gut bacteria makes you happier. And remember, do antibiotics target just one kind of bacteria? No, it's like a shotgun, it just kind of scatters shot and kills different bacteria. And so you begin to have potentially less diversity of gut bacteria. And so, then the next year got bit by a tick again, and, okay, better just do another round of antibiotics. And so 2 years solid, just depressed. Now, I kept going forward, kept producing documentaries, kept traveling the world, kept, doing all of these things, kept reading my Bible and eating a healthy diet, exercising every single day. I love to exercise. I'm just an avid exerciser, so whether it's biking or running or lifting weights or doing push-ups or pull-ups or these kind of things, I love to exercise. And so I was keeping all of these things up, but just depressed. So I pressed forward, but just felt terrible. And so, like I said, what do you do? And even in the midst of it, at the very worst time of my depression, I was still reading my Bible, still praying, still seeking God with all of my heart. Literally. I would go out sometimes and pray and seek God for hours in the woods and, looking, asking for forgiveness of sins, trying to make my life right with the Lord. Trying over and over and over, trying to pay back for the sins of my past, trying to make everything right, calling people up, asking for forgiveness for something I had said or something I had done, doing anything I could to try to feel better, but I was just so thoroughly depressed. And at the worst point of it all, at the very, very worst point of the depression, I prayed and I said, God, if I have to deal with this for the rest of my life, I accept it. I'll just live with it. Where else will I go? You have the words of life. I knew God was the answer, and even if I had to suffer this for the rest of my life, I'd just go forward. I'd just keep sharing the message of the gospel, sharing with other people, hoping other people would have peace, whether I had it or not. I would just go forward. And that's what I did. I just kept going forward. And it wasn't easy, but what else can you do? I'm not going to give up. I know, there's really no other option. God is the true answer, but I just continued to press forward. Well, then I for the first time, heard a quotation that was something called 21 Manuscript Releases, page 286. Strange quotation I had never heard before. And it said this. It said, we are coming to the time when recipes for cooking will not be needed. For the food God gave Adam in his sinless state is the best for keeping the body in a sinless state. And I thought, well, that's strange. The food God gave Adam in his sinless state. What were some of the major things God gave Adam in the garden? Fruits, not even veggies yet. The veggies came after the fall, right? Veggies are good for you. They're phenomenal for you. I'm not knocking veggies. But before, in the garden, they were initially given fruit, right? And so I thought, I guess I'll just eat fruit for a little bit. So this was mid-December, so about the worst time of year. The 21st of December is the shortest day of the year, so if you struggle with seasonal depression, it's about the worst time. But remember, I'd been depressed 2 years solid, so it wasn't really seasonal anymore. But about midway through December, the worst time of year, I decided I was going to go for 2 weeks and eat fruit. And I'm not saying anybody should do this because it's intense, and I'm just kind of an extreme guy, whether it's doing whatever, I'm just kind of extreme. So I thought, I'll just eat fruit for 2 weeks. And I started to do it, and after 2 weeks of eating just fruit, you know what happened? For the first time in 2 years, it was actually about January 1st. So it's, literally the beginning of the year, not this year, it was a few years back. At January 1st, for the first time in 2 years, I could actually control what I would think about. Instead of having these constant oppressive, depressing, guilty feelings, I could choose where I would focus my mind. I could choose to say, no, I'm going to think about something else. And now I could connect with God. And I noticed that it was getting better and better and better. At first, I didn't say anything because I thought, maybe it's just a random good day or something like that. But I just kept pressing forward. And so then obviously after about 2 weeks, I started to add grains back and add vegetables back and nuts and these different kinds of things. And as I was adding them back, my stomach seemed to just get better. And I eat, like I said, 8 pieces of fruit or vegetable. There's no question I eat, in general, I eat that much, no problem every single day. And I started feeling so much better. It was such a blessing to me, but it helped me. Eating a whole food diet ended up helping me with depression. It helped me with achy joints. It ended up it got rid of my migraines. I used to have migraines, they went away. It helped me with hypoglycemia. I used to struggle with that. And once I got rid of, the high-fat foods, that hypoglycemia went away. Hypoglycemia went away. My lack of energy, I have so much energy. So much energy now. It's such a blessing. I've never had so much energy in my life. I was playing with the kids yesterday over at ACE, the school. Run around playing freeze tag. They wanted me to play freeze tag. And boy, those kids could wear you out, though, I'll tell you. I have a lot of energy, but man, those kids They're phenomenal. And so eating whole foods, I seem to have gallbladder pain. My grandpa died from gallbladder surgery, and I was struggling after fatty meals, and that ended up going away, and asthma went away, and allergies went away. I mean, just in so many ways, it changed my life. I used to be able to run a mile in high school in like 9 minutes. I think it was which is not very good, by the way, just in case you're wondering. And then, I think it was last year or the year before, either one. I just thought, I wonder how fast I could run a mile now. So I just, did map my run, hit go, and it would tell me when I hit a mile. And I ran a mile in 5 minutes and 56 seconds. I could never do something like that before. It has literally changed my life in so many ways. And I share all this with you because life is so much better the closer we get to having a healthy gut. Gives us a healthier mind. I don't expect anybody tomorrow to begin to eat the way that I eat, but I can encourage you to begin to add more and more plant-based foods to your diet. Add an apple or an orange or the fruit that you like. Pick the ones you like and make positive, progressive changes and begin to find the benefits that God has for you. And isn't it interesting that, like Fadia said, the first sin came about as the result of food, and the first scientific study in all of recorded history, according to the National Institutes of Health, is about the gut-brain connection. And right now, this is cutting-edge science. So I want to challenge you to test some of these things. Make progressive, positive changes in your own life and see the benefits that they have for you. Let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for health and happiness. We thank you for victory. We thank you for the opportunity to study science and your word. It's so interesting that this study that was done 2,500 years ago in the ancient courts of Babylon, replicated today, enhances the mind of young people, but also enhances the morality. When tested in a prison, Father, we see that it literally turns the prison upside down, turns criminals into happy, healthy citizens who have peace in their hearts. And Lord, whether or not we're criminals, we can find the peace and the joy that you have in these things. We can find victory over addictions. We can find victory over depression. And we can have the peace that we read about in Philippians chapter 4 that passes all understanding. We thank you for your love in the name of Jesus. Amen.